Charles Scott Robinson. In 1994, a jury in Oklahoma convicted Charles Scott Robinson of 6 counts of abuse against a 3-year-old girl. The child was 3, not old enough to understand what was happening, not old enough to explain it afterward. Under Oklahoma law at the time, life without parole wasn't available for his charges. The jury couldn't lock the door permanently, so they built their own lock. They recommended 5,000 years on each count. Judge Dan Owens stacked all 6 consecutively. 30,000 years, the longest prison sentence ever handed down in the United States, recorded in the Guinness Book of World Records. By doing that, Owens told Robinson, I can assure you will spend the rest of your natural life in the Department of Corrections. The jury foreman put it differently. We've seen too many instances of early release. We can't control what happens after this, but by God, we can send a message. Even under the most generous parole calculation, Robinson couldn't walk free until he was 108. Darren Anderson. In 1993, 3 men ran a woman's car off a highway in Tulsa. She was newly married. She was driving home. What happened next lasted hours and crossed 3 locations. The jury convicted Darren Benford Anderson in 1994 and sentenced him to 2,200 years. Most men accept a number like that. They disappear into the system. Anderson appealed. He won a new trial. A new jury heard every detail of that night and convicted him again on every count. The judge this time was not more lenient. He gave Anderson 11,250 years, 9,000 years added because he wanted a second chance. His accomplice, Alan McLaurin, was resentenced to 21,250 years. Together, a single afternoon in one Oklahoma courtroom produced 32,500 years of prison time. Anderson's earliest possible release date is the year 12,744. He's still in a cell in Oklahoma, still serving a sentence that will outlast every structure humans have ever built. Dudley Wayne Kyzer. On Halloween afternoon in 1976, Dudley Wayne Kyzer drove to his estranged wife's mother's house in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. His 6-year-old son was outside with puppies when Kyzer walked through the door. Inside, an argument started. When the mother-in-law reached for the phone, Kyzer drew a pistol and shot her in the forehead. Then he shot a college student who happened to be visiting. Then he chased his wife outside. She grabbed her son and pushed him toward a neighbor's porch. She didn't make it. Kyzer was originally sentenced to death, but Alabama's death penalty was struck down. At retrial, the jury needed another mechanism. They gave him 2 life sentences and 10,000 years for the third murder. It entered the Guinness Book of World Records as the longest sentence ever imposed on a single count. Kyzer has applied for parole 10 times. He's been denied every time. James Holmes. James Holmes entered a PhD neuroscience program at the University of Colorado. Top 1% of his entrance exams, federal research grant. He had been fantasizing about mass murder since adolescence. By 2012, his girlfriend had left and his grades had collapsed. He reported seeing shadow figures at the edges of his vision. A psychiatrist noticed he was potentially dangerous. Then he started buying 4 guns, 6,000 rounds, body armor. He rigged his apartment with explosives and invented a scoring system in a notebook. 1 point per life. On January 20th, 2012, Holmes walked into a midnight screening of The Dark Knight Rises in Aurora, Colorado, tear gas first, then a shotgun into a crowd that couldn't see him through the smoke. 12 people died. 70 were wounded. Police found him in the parking lot afterward. He wasn't running. He was calm, almost waiting. The jury convicted him on all 165 counts. 1 vote kept him off death row. The judge gave him 12 life sentences plus 3,318 years. Ariel Castro. Ariel Castro drove a school bus every morning. He went to church on Sundays and played bass in a band. His neighbors described him as quiet. His daughter called him the best father she had ever known. Behind the boarded windows of 2207 Seymour Avenue in Cleveland, 3 women were chained. He had taken them one at a time. Amanda Berry was 16 when he grabbed her walking home from work. Gina Jesus was 14 when he lured her into his car because he was her friend's father. Michelle Knight was 21 when he snatched her while she was on her way to a custody hearing. For a decade, he kept them locked away, fed once a day, abused hundreds of times. When Knight became pregnant, he beat her until she miscarried 5 times. In May 2013, Berry kicked through a door and screamed for help. Police found all 3 alive. Castro pleaded guilty to 937 counts and received life plus 1,000 years. He told the judge he wasn't a monster. He said he was sick. 33 days later, he hanged himself in his cell. Bobby Joe Long. Bobby Joe Long used to scan classified ads, women selling furniture or small appliances. He'd call the number, listen to the voice, and if a woman sounded like she lived alone, he drove to her house. That's how he abused more than 50 women across the Tampa Bay area before police had any idea a single man was responsible. They couldn't connect the cases. Victims were too shaken. Long never used the same method twice in the same neighborhood. Then in 1984, he stopped releasing them. Over 8 months, he abducted at least 10 women from the streets of Hillsborough County, strangled them, and left their bodies across Florida. A 17-year-old named Lisa McVeigh brought him down. Long grabbed her off her bicycle at 2 in the morning and kept her blindfolded for 26 hours. She memorized every turn, pressed her fingerprints into every surface she could reach, and the moment he released her, she went directly to police. Within days, they were at his door. He confessed to 8 murders. The court sentenced him to death plus 28 life sentences. Florida executed him in 2019. Skolem Weiss. Skolem Weiss never held a weapon. He wore suits and carried a briefcase and sat in boardrooms. In the early 1990s, Weiss helped drain $450 million from a Florida insurance company. The policyholders were elderly retirees. Thousands of them lost everything. The company collapsed. It was the largest insurance failure caused by criminal conduct in American history. Prosecutors offered him 5 years. He refused and demanded a trial. The trial ran 9 months. While the jury was still deliberating, Weiss shaved his beard, obtained a false passport, and disappeared. He fled to Israel, then Brazil, then Belgium, then Austria, living off stolen money while his victims filed poverty paperwork back home. He was convicted on all 78 counts in absentia. The judge sentenced him to 845 years, the longest white-collar sentence in American history. Austrian police eventually arrested him. He was extradited in 2002 and began serving his time. On January 19, 2021, his last full day in office, President Trump commuted the sentence. Weiss walked out the next morning, 845 years reduced to 18. Terry Nichols. On April 19, 1995, a rented truck loaded with 2 tons of fertilizer and fuel oil detonated outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The blast tore the north face off the structure. 168 people died. 19 of them were children in a second-floor daycare. Timothy McVeigh built the bomb and drove the truck. He was executed in 2001. Terry Nichols helped him buy the fertilizer. He helped steal the blasting caps from a Kansas quarry. He helped rob a firearms dealer to fund the operation. The night before the bombing, he helped McVeigh mix the components in the truck bed. Then he drove home. When the building came down, Nichols was hundreds of miles away. He turned himself in 2 days later. Police found blasting caps, ammonium nitrate, and a handwritten map of downtown Oklahoma City inside his home. A federal jury convicted him, but deadlocked on death. Oklahoma tried him again on 161 murder counts, guilty on all 161. The jury deadlocked on death a second time. The judge imposed 161 consecutive life sentences, one for every person who didn't come home. Paul Goodell. In 1911, a 17-year-old orphan named Paul Goodell was working as a bellhop at a hotel in New York City. One night, he slipped into a guest room, pressed a chloroform-soaked rag to the man's face, and tried to rob him. The man suffocated. Goodell was arrested 2 days later and sentenced to 20 years to life. In 1926, as his parole date approached, he was declared legally insane and transferred to Dannemora State Hospital. He stayed there for 46 years. In 1972, officials moved him to Fishkill, a facility for elderly inmates where the rooms looked more like dormitories than cells. In 1974, after 63 years inside, Goodell was offered parole. He refused. He had no family, no one waiting. He had entered as a boy and was now 80 years old. He didn't recognize the country outside those walls. "I can't make it out there," he told a visitor. "They treat me well here." He stayed 6 more years. On May 7th, 1980, Paul Goodell walked out, 68 years after he walked in. "No publicity, please," he said with a small smile. He died in a nursing home 7 years later. Joseph Ligon. Joseph Ligon was 15 years old when Philadelphia police arrested him in 1953. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder by association and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He had not been given a lawyer during questioning. He signed confessions placed in front of him. His trial lasted 1 day. He received no parole hearings, no meaningful review, no pathway out. Ligon spent 68 years in Pennsylvania state prisons, becoming the longest serving juvenile lifer in American history. In 2021, after the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory juvenile life without parole sentences were retroactively unconstitutional, a federal court vacated his sentence. Ligon argued that he didn't want parole. He insisted his sentence had always been unconstitutional and demanded full release, not conditional freedom. The court agreed. On February 11th, 2021, at 83 years old, Joseph Ligon walked out of State Correctional Institution Phoenix without conditions. Alan McLaurin. Alan McLaurin was the second man in the Tulsa attack with Darren Anderson. He stood in the same courtroom and heard the same evidence read aloud. The jury that convicted McLaurin gave him 21,250 years. He appealed. His sentence was reduced by 500 years on appeal, bringing it to 20,750. That reduction did nothing meaningful. The math remained impossible regardless of which direction it moved. McLaurin and Anderson together account for the highest combined sentence ever produced in a single case by American courts. No calculation of good behavior, no change in law, no parole board decision touches either number. Both men remain incarcerated in Oklahoma. The sentence Anderson received after his appeal, 11,250 years, still stands as the longest sentence ever handed down as the direct result of a defendant choosing to challenge his conviction. Dudley Kyzer's case introduced something specific into American legal history. Courts had used large numbers before, but 10,000 years on a single count for a single murder had no precedent. Judges in Alabama needed a mechanism after the death penalty was removed from the table, a number that would survive any legal challenge, any change in statute, any sympathy a future parole board might develop. 10,000 years accomplished that. It was never meant to represent time that would actually be served. It was meant to function as a permanent bar. The Guinness Book of World Records noticed the sentence in its category for longest single-count prison sentence. Kyzer was 50 years old at his retrial. Each parole application had been denied. He has spent more than 4 decades incarcerated across 2 separate trials, outliving the original death sentence that was struck down in his favor. John Edward Robinson. John Edward Robinson operated in Kansas and Missouri during the 1980s and 1990s and was the first known serial killer to find victims online. He used early internet chat rooms to contact women, promising jobs and relationships. At least 8 women disappeared after meeting him. Investigators eventually searched his rural Kansas property and found 2 barrels containing bodies inside his house and 5 more in a storage locker in Missouri. He was convicted of 3 murders in Kansas in 2003 and received the death sentence. Missouri convicted him of 5 additional murders, adding 5 life sentences. Robinson remains on death row in Kansas, still appealing. The bodies of some women he was suspected of killing were never recovered. His wife maintained his innocence for years before quietly distancing herself from his case. Robinson himself has never admitted to the full scope of what investigators believe he did. Sante Kimes. Sante Kimes spent decades running cons across multiple countries. She recruited her own son, Kenneth Kimes Jr., as a partner. Together, they were linked to at least 3 murders, though investigators suspected more. In 2000, both were convicted of murdering New York socialite Irene Silverman, whose home Kenneth had rented under a false identity shortly before she vanished. Her body was never found. Sante received 120 years in New York. Kenneth received 120 years as well. California then convicted them both in 2004 for the murder of a Utah businessman, adding consecutive life sentences to both totals. Sante Kimes died in prison in 2014 at the age of 79. Kenneth, who had cooperated with investigators by the end and led them to burial sites in other cases, remains incarcerated. Sante never acknowledged any of it. She insisted until her death that she and her son had simply been in the wrong places at the wrong time.